In the spring of 1315, the rains did not stop. They fell first as a blessing over the fields of northern Europe, soaking the earth after a long winter. But the blessing became a weight, and the weight became a sentence. Day after day, week after week, low clouds pressed down upon the land. The sky remained a dull iron gray. Paths dissolved into mud. Rivers swelled beyond their banks. The air smelled not of growth, but of rot. To understand what it took to survive this moment, you must first understand the world that existed before it began to unravel. By the early 14th century, Europe had been expanding for generations. Forests were cleared to make way for fields. Marshlands were drained. Population had grown steadily since the year 1000, pressing against the limits of what medieval agriculture could sustain. Most people lived not in cities, but in villages, small clusters of timber, and thatch bound to the rhythm of soil and season. Nearly every life depended on grain: wheat in the south, rye and barley in the north. Bread was not a luxury. It was survival itself. Yet this expansion had pushed cultivation into marginal lands, thin soils, flood-prone valleys, exposed hillsides. Harvests were often modest, even in good years. A single failed crop could strain a village. Two could break it. In 1315, nature withdrew its fragile cooperation. The relentless rains drowned newly sown seeds. Fields could not be plowed without oxen sinking to their knees in mud. Hay cut too late, spoiled before it could dry. Livestock weakened as fodder ran short. In some regions, sheep died by the thousands, their fleeces matted and heavy with moisture. Cattle, essential not only for meat but for plowing, succumbed to disease bred in the damp. Grain yields collapsed. In markets from the Low Countries to the Baltic coast, prices began to climb with alarming speed. A bushel of wheat that once could be purchased with modest coin now cost several times as much. For peasants bound by obligation to lords, there was no relief from rents or dues. For urban laborers, wages did not rise with hunger. The medieval climate, already shifting toward what historians would later call the Little Ice Age, offered no reprieve. Summers were cooler. Winters lingered longer. Crops that required warmth struggled to ripen fully. It was not a single storm, nor a single failed harvest. It was a pattern, persistent, grinding, inescapable. To survive in 1315 was to live within a narrowing margin. Families began by consuming what they had stored. Grain set aside for planting was ground into flour. Seed corn meant for the following year's sowing was eaten in desperation. Livestock were slaughtered prematurely, removing future strength for immediate sustenance. Tools were pawned. Land was mortgaged. Small reserves of cheese, dried peas, salted meat, provisions, intended to bridge the lean, months before harvest, vanished. Weeks too early. Communities prayed. Church bells rang across the countryside, calling villagers to kneel on damp stone floors and ask for mercy from a silent sky. Processions wound through sodden fields. Relics were carried. Fasts were declared, though fasting in such a season had become indistinguishable from daily life. The famine did not arrive as spectacle. It seeped into existence. First came anxiety, then scarcity, then the slow erosion of dignity. Beggars appeared along roads where none had walked before. Children's faces thinned. The elderly, already fragile, began to disappear from parish records. What it took to survive was not heroism in the epic sense. It was endurance, measured in withheld portions of bread, in silent calculations made by candlelight, in decisions no parent should have to consider. And still the rains continued. The year 1315 was only the beginning. By the winter of 1315, it was clear that this was no ordinary scarcity. The hunger had outlasted hope. Across northern Europe, the social fabric began to strain under pressures it had never been built to endure. Medieval society depended upon hierarchy and obligation. Peasants owed labor and rents to their lords. Lords owed protection and stability in return. Markets linked town and countryside. The church offered spiritual meaning to material suffering. Each element assumed that harvests, though variable, would ultimately return. But the harvest of 1315 had failed catastrophically, and when the rains returned in 1316, washing out fields yet again, It became clear that the crisis was compounding. In the countryside, villages that had consumed their seed, grain the previous year found themselves unable to sow properly. Fields lay underworked, not only from waterlogging but from exhaustion. Oxen had died or been eaten. Horses weakened. Without animal power, plowing heavy soils became nearly impossible. Agricultural collapse fed upon itself. Grain prices reached levels unseen in living memory. In parts of what is now France and the Low Countries, the cost of wheat doubled and then tripled. Urban governments attempted price controls, but scarcity cannot be legislated away. Merchants hoarded supplies, waiting for even higher returns. Suspicion spread through marketplaces like a contagion. For those living in cities, craftsmen, laborers, apprentices, the countryside's failure meant empty granaries and rising unrest. Bread riots flickered into existence. Bakers were accused of adulterating flour with husks or ground legumes. Trust eroded. Hunger sharpened grievance. Rulers, too, found their authority tested. In the Kingdom of England under Edward II, royal accounts recorded extraordinary expenditures to secure grain shipments. Yet even a king could not command the weather. Imports were limited. Transport across muddy roads proved treacherous. Barges along swollen rivers capsized. Efforts to redistribute food often faltered before reaching those most in need. Political tensions intensified as famine weakened the legitimacy of governance. Nobles faced falling incomes from their lands just as their tenants faced starvation. Warfare did not cease. Campaigns continued between England and Scotland, draining resources that might otherwise have been directed toward relief. Armies consumed grain that villages could scarcely spare. The famine also exposed the vulnerability of Europe's ecological balance. Years of deforestation and expansion had removed natural buffers against environmental shock. Marginal lands cultivated in times of growth proved the first to fail. Soil erosion worsened flooding. Crop diversity was limited. Reliance on grain left little flexibility when cereals failed. As livestock perished from disease and malnutrition, protein vanished from the diet of the poor. Milk production declined sharply. Cheese and butter became rare luxuries. Meat, already scarce for most peasants, virtually disappeared. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and diseases that might once have been survivable now turned fatal. Chroniclers began to note outbreaks of illness following in the wake of hunger. Desperation altered behavior. Foraging intensified. People stripped forests of edible roots and nuts. They gathered nettles, bark, and anything that might be boiled into sustenance. Fishing increased along rivers and coasts, though swollen waters made even this hazardous. In some regions, records suggest rising theft of food and livestock. Law courts filled with accusations of poaching and grain robbery. The moral order itself seemed under strain. Rumors circulated of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed, of corpses left unburied, because families lacked the strength to dig graves. Whether exaggerated or not, such stories reveal a society grappling with the unthinkable. Yet survival persisted in small, stubborn acts. Communities pooled remaining resources. Some monasteries opened their storehouses to the poor, distributing alms until their own supplies dwindled. Urban guilds organized limited relief for members. Networks of kinship, extended families spread across villages, became lifelines, offering temporary refuge to those hardest hit. Still, the second failed harvest in 1316 confirmed what many feared. This was not a passing calamity, but a systemic collapse. The rhythm of medieval life, plant, harvest, tithe, store, had broken. And when the rhythm of food breaks, everything else begins to fracture. By 1317, the famine had moved beyond scarcity into something more corrosive, an erosion of the boundaries that once defined order, morality, and endurance. For nearly 3 years, harvests had failed across large stretches of northern Europe. Even where crops managed to grow, yields were stunted, insufficient to rebuild reserves. The countryside bore the marks of exhaustion. Fields once neatly divided by hedgerows now lay churned and uneven, scarred by repeated flooding. Livestock herds had been reduced to fractions of their former size. The agricultural engine of medieval society, already fragile, had stalled. In many regions, the famine reached its most brutal intensity not in its first year, but in its third. Those who had survived the initial wave had done so by consuming the future. Seed stocks were gone. Breeding animals had been slaughtered. Tools had been sold or broken from overuse. Even if the skies had cleared overnight, recovery would not have been immediate. Hunger had momentum. Chroniclers began to record scenes that would echo darkly through history. In parts of what is now France and the Low Countries, reports surfaced of people eating horses, dogs, and vermin, animals normally avoided or forbidden by custom. In the worst accounts, whispers of cannibalism appeared. Whether rare or more widespread, such reports signaled the depth of psychological rupture. The famine was not only starving bodies, it was dismantling certainty about what it meant to remain human. Mortality rose sharply. The elderly and the very young were the first to succumb, their bodies least able to withstand prolonged malnutrition. But even strong adults weakened as protein and calories disappeared from daily life. Diseases, dysentery, respiratory infections, fevers of unclear origin spread more easily among populations whose defenses had collapsed. Parish registers where they survive reveal sudden spikes in burials. In some towns, graveyards expanded beyond their traditional bounds. Violence simmered beneath the surface. As desperation deepened, theft grew more common. Grain convoys required armed escorts. In rural districts, starving peasants sometimes raided estates rumored to hold reserves. Authorities responded with harsh punishments, attempting to preserve order through fear. Yet repression could not create food. It could only delay chaos. The psychological toll was equally profound. Medieval people understood suffering through a religious framework. Famine invited interpretation.
By order of the
Was it
crown,
divine punishment?
grain is rationed,
A test of
no
faith?
more until the
A sign of
next
approaching
harvest.
apocalypse? Preachers wrestled with these questions from pulpits heavy with damp air. Some urged repentance. Others spoke of endurance and charity, but faith did not fill empty stomachs. For rulers, the crisis revealed the limits of power. In England, Edward II faced not only external conflict but internal discontent. Royal authority seemed fragile when it could not secure bread. Across regions of the Holy Roman Empire and Scandinavia, similar tensions simmered. The famine did not cause political collapse outright, but it weakened the foundations upon which authority rested. And yet, amid the ruin, survival continued. Uneven, fragile, improbable. Some regions fared slightly better due to local conditions. Coastal communities with access to fisheries managed to supplement their diets. Areas less dependent on marginal grain fields proved more resilient. Trade routes, though strained, still functioned in places, allowing limited redistribution of food from less affected zones. Survival depended increasingly on geography, on chance, on networks of connection. By late 1317, weather patterns began to shift. Rains lessened. Harvests improved modestly. The immediate wave of starvation receded. But the damage had been done. Population losses across parts of northern Europe may have reached 10 to 15%. Entire villages were diminished. Fields lay fallow not by choice but for lack of hands to work them. The demographic shock would linger for decades. The Great Famine did not end with a single abundant harvest. It ended slowly, leaving behind a continent altered, thinner in body, more uncertain in spirit. And as Europe struggled to stand again, another shadow was gathering beyond the horizon. When the rains finally loosened their grip and harvests began cautiously to recover after 1317, survival did not feel like triumph. It felt like absence. Across northern Europe, the famine left behind a quieter landscape. Villages still stood, but many doors remained closed. Fields once crowded with laborers
Terms
now
are
required
clear.
fewer hands,
Your yield
not
is
because
assured.
efficiency had improved,
Aye, my
but
lord.
because the missing would not
We
return.
agree.
In some regions, as much as a tenth or more of the population had vanished within 3 years. The loss was not uniform, but it was unmistakable. The famine's end did not restore what had been consumed. Livestock herds had to be rebuilt slowly from surviving stock. Seed reserves were scarce, forcing cautious planting. Malnutrition had stunted children who would carry its effects into adulthood. Bodies that endured years of hunger did not quickly regain strength. Yet in the aftermath, subtle transformations began to unfold. With
Grains
fewer
fresh,
laborers
mind the
available,
measure.
surviving peasants in
Aye,
certain
fair
areas found
sack for these.
themselves in a marginally
Count them
stronger
well.
bargaining position. Lords who had once dictated terms with confidence now faced shortages of workers to till their estates. In some places, rents were adjusted, obligations renegotiated. These changes were uneven and often resisted, but the demographic shock had shifted the balance, however slightly. Markets, too, recalibrated. Grain prices gradually stabilized as harvests improved, though volatility lingered. Communities that had learned the peril of over-reliance on marginal land reconsidered cultivation patterns. In some regions, the most vulnerable fields were abandoned. Forests slowly reclaimed slopes that had proven unsustainable. The famine had exposed the ecological limits of expansion. The psychological scars, however, endured. For those who had lived through the years of relentless rain, memory itself became a burden. Parents who had measured portions of bread to keep children alive carried forward an instinctive caution. Hoarding, once condemned, became understandable. Trust in markets and authorities had frayed. The belief that order was guaranteed by divine favor felt less certain. Chroniclers wrote of the famine as a moral reckoning, yet beneath theological interpretation lay a practical recognition. Europe had grown beyond what its agricultural system could reliably sustain. The population boom of the preceding centuries had rested on fragile foundations, thin soils, predictable weather, stable yields. When climate shifted toward cooler, wetter patterns at the dawn of what historians now describe as the Little Ice Age, that fragility was revealed without mercy. The Great Famine did not stand alone in history. It formed part of a larger sequence of crises that would define the 14th century. A generation later, epidemic disease would sweep across the continent with devastating force. But the famine came first. It weakened bodies, strained institutions, and unsettled confidence. It taught Europe in the harshest possible way that prosperity was contingent. To survive between 1315 and 1317 required more than endurance of hunger. It demanded choices that reshaped families and communities. It required the surrender of livestock meant for the future, the consumption of seed meant for spring, the acceptance of loss without explanation. Survival was measured not in abundance regained, but in breath sustained one winter more. When the sky cleared and crops rose again from the earth, they did so over soil that had absorbed suffering. The famine's memory lingered in sermons, in local records, in the cautious habits of those who had endured it. It became part of a collective awareness that the natural world could not be commanded, only navigated. In the end, the Great Famine was not a sudden catastrophe that passed like a storm. It was a slow constriction of possibility, a tightening circle around ordinary lives, and survival in that tightening was not heroic in the way chronicles prefer. It was quiet. It was stubborn. It was human. Europe would rebuild. It always did. But after 1315, it rebuilt with the knowledge that the margin between stability and collapse was thinner than anyone had imagined, and that survival, once stripped to its essence, depends on forces far beyond any kingdom's control.